talk.
Chomsk is certain this is enough material to...
Nope.
Chomsk works feverishly on the data acquired so far, structuring it into three areas. One, the physical properties of the world. Two, the physical properties and development of the organism speaking. Three, the language and cultural properties of the speakers. He makes sure that each entry is tied back to at least two sources, then repeats and structures the data over and over. The purpose is not to let these ideas congeal. It is to make a small mental model of each thing that the human spoke of so he could try and guess to the extent he could guess at a given property. Why the property would exist in a given property/human group or not. The aim was to build, if he could, a model that allowed him to begin making hypotheses and to start proving or disproving those hypotheses with experimental methods. This way of approaching the problem seemed to work well with the process he and Skona had come up with. If one element of his guess seemed incorrect, or the structure was fundamentally broken, that was information to him. But there was a little time before lunch to try out new models. If one did not pan out, it did not mean he'd gone too far from the correct idea. It only meant he'd found out, and found out quickly, what didn't work. The value of a well-constructed model, according to his physics training, is not in telling you that the model is correct. If he used one of the models and it did not hold, he could then simply go to the other ones in the model tree until he found one that did hold. Of course, for any given property of an entity in one branch, it might hold for that exact branch, or not. But it might help find other models which could shed more light. Chomsk spent some time trying to explore his newly assembled model, putting aside for the moment any considerations of what it all might mean for the culture. If any one property was holding true across the many worlds in which the species evolved, and thus wasn't a purely emergent property of a certain ecosystem, but a feature which existed independent. A single ecology that would be useful for explaining how and why these people develop so consistently similar languages across all the worlds they had. One very nice side benefit was the ease of creating a working model in such cases, since no language feature would be exclusively in one group of human people and never in another group. That natural state for a particular linguistic property would not have to be adjusted to fit different language systems. This was a major sticking point, it seemed, for Skona, which meant it might take them a long time to model even a small area of their own home universe, assuming the local human population ever proved to speak the same language consistently. Another thing he noted at first he found quite peculiar was that whatever they were certainly people. There were several examples, almost enough to assume as fact. People referred to Chomsk's thinking not only to intelligent animals such as dogs or apes, but Chomsk decided to make this an hypothesis as the only conclusion to reach after a dozen times trying to tie everything to other data in his model was to assume, as it was his task to do so, that people referred not just to animal life forms that use tools in the wild, but any sapient being. Any being with the capacity to modify their own environment to speak and to name the objects they dealt with. In addition, people with tools seem to have some kind of association with each other. One world even showed humans having wars and creating objects with the intention to hurt or kill people. And yet they seem to share at least one quality. They each possessed an understanding that with their group and their culture and their individual cultures, they would probably live beyond the limit of the individual lifespan of any given people. This understanding appeared to give the species a motivation for changing the way the world worked and also made them feel safe doing so. They wanted the next world for their children, not for themselves. In the most plausible scenarios, even their ability to alter the very fabric of matter on which they all lived was to their species a completely benign force. Chomsk's side, continuing on his original line of thinking for the time being, that people would understand their lives were very temporary. However, the idea seemed to conflict with some of the observed facts of how many people they could observe who did appear to have the same attitude. They made temporary arrangements. If a child died, its parents simply made some kind of a temporary replacement until the child was older and able to join a family, for example. So clearly, he didn't know much about the true purpose of people on these different worlds and would have to revisit them when he looked into all of the details he could gather. And in any event, he continued his work and modeled out an additional half of the puzzle as time wore on, working through every pattern in every linguistic and physical property he could, and many of their cultures, until something came up. Victory, a hypothesis he could make even if not so sure to be proven. What Tree had to do with the number of syllables in the speech of each people. One syllable, two syllable, three. Syllable types seem to exist on their worlds based on his observations of the patterns they showed across most or all of their cultures except on a few. These had longer or shorter, multisyllable, compound sounds that could make one language's speech pattern very hard to transcribe, while other sounds seem to vary within certain limitations on any one planet, a distinction not true with another human culture. The model suggested a systematic change from longer to shorter or longer to louder speech. Some had shown to Chomsk's thinking to be very slight changes. Humans had very slightly different types of phonemes to create sounds such as slash o slash and slash u slash when it came down to it, as opposed to a change to how a more fundamental slash e slash or slash I slash was sounded. Another similarity we saw across all the types of words people seem to create. The fact they were able to speak, or vocalize at least, was usually accomplished by different body parts. A hand to point a finger at a name and slash or a body to turn a phrase or move an object and slash or a mouth to vocalize and slash or to yell something out in pain and slash or joy. Not just that, but in some cases the sound in specific words or even parts of words could change drastically depending on what action you were doing, such as in a body gesture to emphasize your voice, but the fundamental shape of a vocalization seemed to remain the same across many languages and peoples, with a few variations on vocalizations for individual peoples. For instance, some had a voiced vowel for n slash u slash, so even this would change from world to world. So far, he had not noticed anything else consistent across languages. This led to history being drawn to the final conclusion. It seemed he needed only to tie every observed property of the human species to language types. Humans may speak the same language, and they may appear to be the same as each other in how they use language, but one major variable which he'd only be able to deduce would have been left out at first. For his current work, Chomsk was convinced he should separate what he was currently working on from the problem of where does it lead. His current approach allowed for his models of the physics and of the physiology of a certain species to lead him in time to a large set of human language traits. So the best place for my studies for the present and near future, however much of it, said Chomsk aloud, which might lead to an entire area for further research, agreed one voice that hadn't spoken yet. He was startled and looked around to see if anybody had entered the auditorium since he'd been lost in thought. Skona's face peeked up at him over the edge of his chair from below the main platform's level. Chomsk just nodded, more to himself, but in response to her words. He focused his concentration to a spot he'd come to see on the screen nearby. A screen displaying his models one after the other for examination and modification. This will be more fun, he said to Skona as she floated in a chair beside him to study his latest progress. Much less wasted time, more concentrated effort. He got more of the chairs at the tables they sat at, lined with workstations from below, making more space around him for Skona to be comfortable and in one place to examine all of his models together. It didn't take them long before they realized their first breakout brunch had done quite well to describe their current results. But a question emerged at this point in his thoughts and needed to be put forth for anyone interested in making their own guesses on what to look at next. Chomsk let it bounce around for the moment and wondered where this query would lead next. Where For your people's example, will their physics take the same species and lead them into an area that would suggest that it might have some important trait regarding language when it is no longer needed for the task? Perhaps where this leads into an understanding that such a species may never stop their intellectual exploration on where else their physics can take them. The doors opened, it was noon. Folks were back, the Grugs and the Bleep Bloops. Grug, what is this? Bleep Blorp, a convening center. Grug, where are the burial sites? This is where we bury our ancestors. Chomsk, oh my. Well, this is a temporary build for our purposes. Now it is. Thank you for bringing that up. We will reconstitute the corpses, I mean your ancestors, when we leave this place in a few days. They're here, just pulverized, but they're fine. Now, Bleep, take these folks' names, Grugs, so you remember who you met today. Then ask them to leave you alone. You are not a part of our work in progress. I need the area emptied so as to give us as much room as I need. Bleep, not a problem. We'll wait just out the corridor there. As agreed, Grug. We will let you get on with it. We did take this opportunity to introduce our friend Grub to another one of the group's individuals we're responsible for overseeing, who just recently became known to the world. The fellow we discussed previously who wasn't able to go to that lecture. For instance, despite all your pleading with your people and the earthlings in attendance. Grug, thank you, Blob, for being our introduction to him, as it were. Leap, your appreciation is very much appreciated. The screen changed, giving Grugs another set of boxes. He spoke to the other 4 people in the group now. Folks, I thank you for meeting me. He spoke aloud in case there were anyone nearby who wanted to listen to him. My friends, I would like to introduce you to our visitors to this work site here on the world. A pair of Bleep Bloops and their colleagues, the Grug clan from the other universe that, according to your visitor's tale, evolved here in this world. Grug is the closest translation I was able to figure out to Grug. So Grug is my friend over there. Bloop is standing on his hand. There are some questions I need answered in regard to our evolution that my colleagues are willing to assist in. Will you have time later for a long session on a few different topics, some of which as of yet are, in your opinion, a bit hard to fathom? Bleep bloop. Our pleasure, sir. Bloop. You're welcome, Grug. Bleep bloop. Our pleasure, sir. Grug. My pleasure. Thank you, Blorp bloop. Bloop. Our pleasure. Thank you. Grug. By your leave, we shall, at your pleasure, sir, and thank you, as well as Bloops. Thank you, Bloop. Thank you. By your leave, and may you all prosper too. Grug and Bloop watched Chomsk with an air of contemplative interest while Grugs waited for the final information they needed from Bloop. Bloop studied Chomsk with an air of contemplation. The last piece of data that the group wanted from Bloop came to an abrupt end. A signal indicating the topic they now knew their counterparts were anxious to ask him about. The tone was tense, a type of nervousness unlike before when they had asked the question, and now there was some sense of not knowing the answer to it. Something important, too. Bloop wasn't a human being like Chomsk. He didn't have hands for Chomsk to write things on with, and his hearing wasn't sensitive like the four human visitors were. But can I just write notes? Asked Grugs. That's okay, right? I know we discussed this with the Earthlings last night, but just a quick reminder for your new visitor's sake, said one of the two Earthling visitors who had visited their camp this morning, standing as though there weren't an extra pair of knees behind his back, and used Lightboard to begin displaying what the bleep bloops had recorded from a set of sensor pads on each of the 5 Earthling males when the bloops had started recording with them in the room, during breakfast, during dinner, and so on. A full record of the group's dinner, conversations, and work, through to a recorded sketch of some of the drawings by one of their group that they had to help interpret what the pictures were all about. Loop stared with interest at one of the sketches as it rotated a few times in front of the group. The group all fell silent, listening intently to it, to a drawing the Earthlings had shown him for the first time ever on their last night's visit, when they were telling them about the physical abilities they would need to make any translation on the parts of the star systems and planets' moons in a different system the group now knew to be of importance in their tale, called the tree. We are particularly interested in any star system that may contain planets capable of supporting a wide range of life, like this planet called Terra Nova. Of the world here, the moon we were given information on, the last sentence was written and pointed out by an Earthling. The actual image of it, one of the closest renderings Chomsk had yet made in his effort to study their work. You can tell at a glance there's no one like us here, one of the Earthlings explained. They could all see for themselves how similar, as Blue put it to them in his own explanation. Bloop did not realize his lack of arms made any difference in the response he got in response to his remark, which they assumed meant he didn't need arms to draw the concept. But Bloop was shocked that someone like the Earthling could write for his lack of arms. The image Bloop had drawn of the moons and star system as the Earthlings explained it had just the one moon, not five. The curiosity on this point was unanswered. But Gruggs reminded him, "You'll find this one's writing much the same, I suspect. Same style, as close to our writing as I can do. It's hard for us to make that ourselves." Grug spoke briefly, almost without meaning to Bloop in English. "Your drawings, by the way, have no connection at all with this Earth. This world and you can never connect." Chomsk's efforts to summarize and add new information in terms that their group could easily grasp fell to the wayside here in a storm of information that poured down from a tall screen with a small amount of white text to blue, which he tried to keep his eyes off. As the group began discussing their results on one part, with the humans' notes about the physics as reference. The next piece of news shocked all in the room. It was time to pack it all up. Chomsk told the Earthlings that there were better things for the group to be looking for in terms of how to reach a certain conclusion as the group went to put their heads together over a concept for further examination. Chomsk got a feel of what they meant. The group felt like a test had passed and they were now ready to move on to new challenges and to do new things, exploring. "Where do you come from?" We have an equivalent, asked the young Earthling to Chomsk as she brought up the record of one of their latest excursions and discussions from the previous few days, the conversation she was trying to recall about her particular interest from that very first visit on this planet where he was last week. Bloop wasn't with the group. They weren't aware of any bleak bloops coming up in this group, and their question of bloop and where they came from was never really answered. The conversation with this visitor had brought to light to them one other matter about the nature of the four visitors and the other parts of the universe. She had told them in the way one did as an Earthling on another planet that existed only because of their presence here, a planet named Skona. One that had a population that Chomsk would later have to go and meet if only as one of the first in line to be in touch with the beings. In one part of the discussion on her previous trip, Chomsk had learned that there were at least other places they could go. There were other locations outside of this star system. And they had no real choice that these other worlds and places would have to be done about their current schedule. That meant time had come, but in a hurry, there wasn't really a lot of time. Chomsk, having gone out in the field many times with some of his bleak bloops, took note of what they brought in from one particular part of the deserts they knew as the system that Bloop's group had now said they had used the life systems for the evolution of all the life on this planet. one day, some years from now, when the first generation of people of both species arrived in Skona from one of these systems, as it would turn out, some would recognize what had been left by an early pair of explorers with more patience to mine out that life system before people were born. That to protect their very survival and what the others called the bounds by some term that nobody at this point really knew what the phrase was supposed to be. There'd be a certain curiosity in the nature of this, and this later age, Chomsk would, without question, go out with an attempt to find the ones who'd done that early digging out of a planet where these very bounds happened. They would want to know where their ancient friends of that group and group-related activities happened to have left a part of themselves in the rocky ground they found when they had taken out an exploration rig in a desert they visited when the bounce first came after they first noticed its pattern. How deep they'd left the marks behind for them, the history that it might have taken the help of some life to start. They thought before the rocks had turned over to form the rocks in the field that their blow-pops would now be finding themselves in that day, this early day of the universe before people from one of the groups decided they'd follow their lives more seriously. The life they'd find from another bounce with groups friends had been made there to provide evidence to the existence of these earlier systems that these ancient people, those early friends of Chomsk and those of Bloop's group's ancestors in this distant time before Chomsk came here in a similar period of history and time from theirs, and probably once found, were dug out from where their digging took place in those earliest times before the bounds. Then Bloop's group were asking Bloop, where did the stuff come from that's all over the place and are so alive? As Bloop's group got up from their benches with excitement and happiness to be making the trips out into their world, showing off what their friends, the ones they lived with as earthling like, could do with them and all for them to get from point A to point B as their favorite things were done.
Alright, that's it for now. That's it for now.